Hi, you're listening to Scribble Talk Teaching, a podcast for bid and proposal professionals. My name is Bhaskar Sundaram. I'll be sitting down with our industry veterans to dive deep into the topics that business winning professionals like you can use to help grow your skills and your business. Today's guest is Richard Goodwin, Managing Director of the JGA Group, which is a well-established apprenticeship training provider to government and the growth function of commercial organizations. Prior to joining the family company, Richard held marketing, sales, procurement, operations, and strategic roles within British Steel and the Stationery Office. Richard holds a degree in economics and international studies from University of Warwick and an MBA from Warwick Business School. You might have guessed the topic already. Yes, we are going to talk about apprenticeships for growth functions. Richard, welcome to Scribble Talk. Great to have you.
Thank you very much, Bhaskar. It's very nice to be here.
Richard, let's go to the very basics. Why does apprenticeships exist?
I guess the first thing to remember is an apprenticeship is a brand name. So it's a brand name like university or degree or similar that's protected by law in the UK. And so an apprenticeship is to some degree what the government says it is. And secondly, an apprenticeship is coming from the tradition of the crafts going back hundreds of years to the guilds and goldsmiths and things like that. In those days, of course, people used to pay to be allowed to be an apprentice because it guaranteed them a lucrative future career. And some aspects of that, not the apprentice paying, but hopefully the empowering future career still sits with apprenticeships, and that's why we have them. Essentially, the apprenticeships were rejigged about 5 years ago, redeveloped 5 years ago, when the government realized that there was a productivity crisis in the UK. And it looked at the education and training that was available and said, okay, it's all very well people going to university and doing a degree in philosophy or whatever it is that people want to do. And courses and qualifications like that have lots of value, but they don't teach you how to be a marketer, how to be a bid writer, how to get on with your colleagues, how to manage your time in a workplace sense, how to be proactive and a self-starter. They don't teach you how to be the sorts of roles that have the sorts of skills and the knowledge and the behaviors that are needed in the workplace. So apprenticeships were redeveloped along the lines of specific job roles. So just to be clear, Bhaskar, groups of employers got together called Trailblazers, and they said, okay, we have skill shortages in these roles. And one of them, for example, is bid and proposal coordinator. So there is very limited formal training in the world on how to be a bid and proposal coordinator. It just doesn't exist. It's not, there's no faculty out there at a college or university that teaches this stuff. It's a very young profession. It's a profession not many people are aware of, and it's a growing and increasingly important profession for lots of obvious reasons that your listenership will know all about. So these companies got together and they said, okay, what are the skills that a bid and proposal coordinator needs? What is the knowledge that a bid and proposal coordinator needs? And what are the behaviors that a bid and proposal coordinator needs to be able to exhibit? So for example, that sort of role, often there's a project management element. You're working to deadlines. When you're getting near the deadlines, everybody works longer hours, but then the quid pro quo is often you get a bit more flexibility with your time at other times. And so it's moving people into this mindset of the soft skills as well as the harder skills. And the harder skills are things like being able to manage your time and the knowledge of the business development cycle. How do bid and proposal coordinators, for example, fit into the business development cycle? What is capture? what goes before writing, what are stages of the bid, what's a red review, what's a pre-mortem and a post-mortem, and so forth. So there's lots of knowledge that's very specific to that role, which is not widely appreciated. And it's all about the industry trying to professionalize and trying to have formal training that are really focused on what people need to do those specific jobs.
Nice. That's very interesting, Richard. So, Richard, you talked about trailblazers and stuff. Once the trailblazer came up with, I think I understand that, part of the JGA group, you do a lot of apprentices. But for the sake of the podcast, I think we will stick with the bid and proposal apprenticeships, if that's okay, so that it kind of relates better to the audience. So let's talk about, just generally, you already gave a flavor for apprenticeships is kinds of gives people the soft skill plus specific to a role. Talk through about how much does the apprenticeships cost, the bid and proposal apprenticeships, and any kind of the what part of the apprenticeships, please?
I think you need to step back a little first, Bhaskar, and say, what's the purpose of the apprenticeship, or fundamentally, conceptually, it's a deal. It's an agreement, and it's an agreement between four parties. One of those is the government, and the government wants a more productive workforce. One of those is the training provider, and the training provider is getting paid to provide some training. One of those is the apprentice themselves, and sometimes the apprentice are moving into a role, and it's not a new job. What they're buying into is a career, and they're going to end up with a qualification with some very specific training that will equip them to move up the career ladder and do better in future. And as a result, sometimes some companies and some apprentices are willing to accept slightly less money in terms of salary in the short term. In addition to which, the government gives all sorts of financial benefits on national insurance contributions and things to employers that employ apprentices. But the company in exchange is getting someone who's rawer. So they're not, in case of bid and proposal coordinator, buying in an experienced bid and proposal coordinator. They're accepting that the person they're working with, the apprentice, is somebody who doesn't already have those skills and that knowledge and those behaviors down pat. They haven't been doing it for 20 years, or if they have been doing it for 20 years, they haven't had formal training on what the job requires. And particularly in these sorts of new roles, there's a lot of case of upskilling of existing staff who may have been in the role but never had formal training on how to be really good at that job. So the apprenticeship is used both for new recruits, but also to upskill existing staff who maybe haven't had formal training and would welcome the opportunity, and for whom productivity is key, and productivity increases and effectiveness in the bid world increases if you know what you're doing better and you understand more about how you fit into the process and the world. And the fourth party, of course, to the agreement essentially is the employer, and the employer is perhaps paying a little bit less in salary. They're getting some grants from the government, but in the quid pro quo is, as I say, they're working with somebody who doesn't have all those skills to start with. They may not be poorly educated. They may have a PhD, but it may be a PhD in philosophy or engineering or something, but it's not a PhD in being an apprenticeship coordinator or bid writing or whatever else. So they are accepting that there's someone there who's a bit raw in terms of their ability, or not their ability to do the job, but their expertise in doing the job. And therefore, they won't be as productive at the beginning. They will need hand-holding in-house. They'll need some mentoring. Some of that is provided by the training provider, but you have to accept that an employer will have systems that person doesn't know how to use. They will be using software that may be unique to that employer, or is just different. It's very specific to the role, and therefore, if you haven't done the role before, you don't know the software. So there are elements which will be on the job training, and the employer will be expected to support the apprentice to get up to speed with that kind of stuff. So going back to your actual question, which was how much do apprenticeships cost? The answer is, generally speaking, for large organizations in the UK, in terms of paying for training, the apprenticeships cost nothing. And in fact, there may even be some government money to subsidize in terms of national cuts to national insurance, grants for young people who are taken onto jobs as apprentices, and so forth. So there may be some financial positives as well as just a lack of cost. But the quid pro quo, as I say, of course, is if your a line manager is mentoring somebody, then clearly there is a cost element because there's a cost of time. And that apprentice will be spending some of their time doing training with the training provider. And clearly, again, there's some of that where if they are sitting in a classroom or on Teams or on Zoom with a coach or with a tutor, then clearly they're not writing a bid or coordinating a bid or managing a bid. They're learning how to do it better, and the next bid they manage or coordinate or write will be better done than the last one, but they're not doing it at that moment. So clearly there's a cost in terms of the apprentice spending some of their time doing what we call the off-the-job training. And that's really it in terms of costs. The reason it's essentially free to large organizations is that every large organization has a payroll tax that they pay to the government every month. It comes off automatically from the payroll. And that payroll tax, which is roughly 0.5% of the salary bill of the organization, disappears into an online account. And that's the money stacks up in there until the organization, the employer, decides to spend it on apprenticeships. And if after 2 years or 24 months, to be strictly accurate, they haven't spent it, then the money starts to disappear to the treasury. So at any point in time, you have, and a large organization has 24 months worth of tax in that account that it can use to spend on training for apprenticeships, or it cannot use it, and it may just elect to not bother. And after 2 years, it writes off the money and it goes to the treasury and pays for the army or the NHS or Department for Education or wherever it may go. I think more and more it's fair to say that employers are getting cute about this, and they're finding ways to adapt apprenticeships to their businesses. So there are some employers, for example, who use apprentices to support graduate recruitment, and that could be a bid and proposal coordinator, or it might be team leading or management or something like that. Don't think that just because an apprenticeship may be at a level 3 or a level 4, it's not necessarily appropriate for somebody who has a degree. It may absolutely be appropriate for them. It's just an area in which they haven't learned things before. So apprenticeships cost time and care. They give you the opportunity to grow people in-house, to incorporate your culture into their way of thinking, and to grow your own fundamentally with the advantages that has. But it also has disadvantages in terms of time mentoring, little bit of time, but just spent in off-the-job training and so forth. But there's no real cost explicitly to a large organization, and there may be grants that they can get back. For small organizations, it's slightly more complicated and a little bit upside down in the sense that there is a cost, but it is a very small cost. So the actual training costs 5 to 10% of the price, with the government paying between 90 and 95% of the money. So we're talking about a few £100 for an apprenticeship, generally speaking, for a small organization. Once an organization gets above £3 million in terms of its payroll, then it becomes a large organization for the purpose of which we're talking, and things become free. Does that help, Bhaskar? Have I confused everybody, or was that reasonably straightforward?
You simplified as much as you can, but you're right. It's a kind of a little minefield when 4 parties are involved, as you rightly said: the government, the trainee, and then the corporate and the rest, etc., and the learning provider. So if you can demystify this as an example, Richard, for example, there is the large company, and the large company has a pot of money, as you rightly said, 0.5% allocated. What happens, Richard, if they decide I'm going to allocate that pot of money to apprenticeships? What happens, Richard, after that? They come and search for apprenticeship providers. Then they also coordinate with the learning provider to understand how this 2-year program will work. How long is this apprenticeship programs in general? How does the administrative process of this whole thing works, Richard?
Okay, so the trailblazer who originally defines the job role and says these are the skills and the knowledge and the behaviors that really make a brilliant bid and proposal coordinator, put in an estimate of how long they think that the program will be. And then each training provider that standard, that list of skills, knowledges, and behaviours, and the way it's assessed becomes the target, if you like. And it's up to the other apprenticeship providers to go away and have a think, how can we work with employers and work with apprentices to upskill them, or whether they're a recruit or whether they're already in the role, to reach the standard set by that target. And ours, for example, for bid and proposal coordinators, is a 21-month programme. And the last 3 months of that is preparing for the final assessment. And the final assessment is independent. It's by a third party, in fact, in this case, by the Institute of Sales Professionals, who are working with the APMP, so Association of Proposal Management Professionals, to do the assessment and to define, that somebody is a good or a great bid and proposal coordinator. Maybe it would help if I just gave you a flavour of what's in ours. Bid and proposal is very niche. You could start by Googling. If you Google bid and proposal coordinator apprenticeships, I imagine you'll find the small number of providers, and you'll also find the government page about that particular apprenticeship. As far as I know, at the moment, there are only, I think, 2 providers of bid and proposal coordinator apprenticeships. It's very niche, it's growing. It's an area where, like I say, there's no history of apprenticeships or background, and we found that it's proven most popular amongst organizations that come from industry sectors that work with apprenticeships anyway, because they understand the concept. It's big in construction, it's big in logistics, it's bigger in outsourced services. And we've just got our first law firms and 1 or 2 other sectors on board. Interestingly, the technology sector hasn't really caught up, as far as I know, certainly not on our program, with the possibilities of apprenticeships. But some of the other outsourced services and professional services certainly are getting there. If you look at our apprenticeship over the first 18 months of the program, the sorts of learning that are covered, the first module is all about context. So it's a background of bidding and how it fits into the business development cycle, approaches to preparation, and how pipeline activities are tracked. Secondly, roles and responsibilities of the bid team, outlining who does what, how the bid managers and the proposal managers and the writers and the graphic and knowledge-based managers and the graphic and designers, how it all fits together and what stages of the life cycle they interact, how it's a project and how it's handled professionally. Capture planning, more details about the end stages of the cycle, no bid decision making, gate stages, customer engagement, competitive tendering and presentations, roles and responsibilities of the bid team. So the coordinator's role, the importance of communication in particular, which features in a lot of apprenticeships. Communication is a big one. That and time management recur an awful lot. How roles change when bidding as part of a consortium where it's more complex and you're not necessarily the lead in that consortium, and suddenly it's a different game entirely. Looking at schedules, clarification questions, follow detailed proposals from qualification through to request for information, through to solution development, bid resource allocation, proposal writing development, production and submission. Managing the process, meetings, workshops, tracking progress, time management, using templates and systems and procedures, ensuring the necessary steps, reviews and signatories are planned prior to final proposal. There's a little bit more, and I won't go into everything. Using bidding software, for example, how e-portals work, good practice and bad practice, key issues and win strategies. And at the end, our program at least culminates in an online virtual world where the apprentices all form teams and they are given a tender in a sector in which none of them are familiar. So it's completely fair to everybody. There is a bid director, there is a subject matter expert, there is all the other roles, the project manager, there are all the other roles you would expect in a real bid. And the apprentices have 3 days in this virtual world in their teams to research the subject, put together and submit a bid and try to win it. And it takes place in Verbella. So it's a virtual world, it's different, it's online, it's stimulating, and it really encapsulates everything that people are doing on their course. And it seems to work, because certainly, I can't speak for other people, but certainly our apprentices are going through the endpoint assessment and they're doing very well. And lots of distinctions and lots of very, very good grades. So we're really proud of the bid and proposal apprenticeship, and we think it does something that hasn't been done before for the bid team. Structured formal training that brings people up and helps professionalize the profession, as it were, if that makes any sense. And we have aspirations later on, perhaps, that the Trailblazer may get back together and look to put together a level 5, maybe a bid writer apprenticeship and a bid manager apprenticeship. So allowing people to progress to more senior levels through the same sort of learning. And I think the key to take away is that it's absolutely focused on their day-to-day role. Everybody has an individual plan, and that individual plan is based on their job and the systems that they use and the aspects that they perform. I always say, if somebody can't turn around from their apprenticeship learning within an hour and use it, then it's not working properly for them. It's really vocationally focused in the absolute best sense of the word.
Thank you, Richard. Thank you for sharing. Richard, you mentioned that obviously COVID accelerated the pace of change, and the whole world kind of operates in virtual domain. How is the general apprenticeship learning done, Richard? The modules, do they study online and then they go for the experiential learning within their company? Does the whole process work, and how is it managed on a monthly basis, progress reports, etc., Richard?
That's a great question, Bhaskar. Thank you. Well, we started with a fairly traditional model, and I think that was because a lot of our employers and clients expected a fairly traditional model. So when we started the bid and proposal apprenticeship 2 or 3 years ago, people would spend a day a month in a, for want of a better phrase, a classroom, although it wasn't actually in a school, of course, it was a meeting room in an office or similar, with a tutor in a small group. And then we would have a coach doing one-to-one sessions, which were also often delivered very physically. And we realized with pandemic and lockdown and the enforced to move to Teams and to Zoom, that actually for very niche professions like bid and proposal, the remote way is the way to do it. We have had almost no dropouts as a result of the pandemic. Bid teams have been valued, and the training is still valued, and it really hasn't made any difference that people are working remotely through Zoom and Teams. And it's fair to say that as we've embraced this apprenticeship, I think we have about 50 apprentices on the bid and proposal program, and our competitors probably have a similar number, I should think. And therefore, you can imagine that if you're looking at the map of the UK, it means those apprentices are scattered right around the UK, from County Durham down to Exeter. And so if you were to put people physically in the classroom, there would be a lot of people who just would be unable to be involved, because employers not being able to afford the time or the money to ship people across the country to go to classes. So in fact, the remote delivery has worked really well for this apprenticeship, and we're delighted, quite frankly. And the same is applied to a lot of our other sales and marketing and communication apprenticeships, because they're all very niche, and therefore you're never going to get the geographical density, and the quality of education really doesn't seem to have suffered. It's fair to say that we do satisfaction metrics, and 99% of people, so it was a lot more than 99 people, rated their last coaching session as good or excellent. And for us, a coaching session is one-to-one. So apprentices spend an hour or a couple of hours a month one-to-one with an expert coach, who in the case of our coach, it's the coach that helped put the course together in the first place. She is a bid writer. She writes bids as well as working for us. So we're not fussy. We're not an institution where people have been sitting gathering dust for 20 years. These are people who really live in the bidding world, and they make proposals, and they teach as well. And secondly, we have monthly tuition. So it's a day a month, or sometimes it's 2 half days if people prefer that, because of Zoom and Teams is slightly harder wearing on people than spending a day in a room. And so again, it's delivered by Zoom and Teams, and it seems to work. We're really pleased. We're really pleased with how it's gone. We're pleased that apprentices are learning, and there's lots of enthusiasm, and that and it works remotely, and which enables people from all over the country to be involved in things that they wouldn't otherwise have the opportunity to do. And I think that makes a difference. As we come out of the pandemic, we're looking again at what we do and how we do it. But I think our general feeling is we'd like to keep a primarily virtual model and see how things go around that.
100%, Richard. I think you're kind of simplifying it, but my head is spinning. I mean, like there are so many moving parts here.
There are. I'm afraid I'm not very good at simplification because it's quite complicated. But essentially, an apprenticeship is small group training and one-to-one training. So it's not a university class of 100 people. It's no more than 15 people tops in a classroom, but generally far fewer than that, and one-to-one time with expert coaches. And that's really what defines an apprenticeship, and that's why it's vocational, because that coach can look at your the apprentice's individual needs and B working environment and make sure that the course directly relates to it. But I appreciate that because anything that involves government, there's lots of things that go on behind it, and it can come across as complex from the outside.
Totally, Richard. Richard, I assume that you have a set cohort that starts at regular start points every year, because every companies tend to have their own year ends, right? Sometimes, as you rightly said, hey, we haven't used this budget last minute, 2 weeks before the year end. They're just want to spend the money. Not necessarily that will align to your cohort start date.
Yeah.
How does that work? I mean, like 15 people start in set times every year or twice a year. Secondly, okay, people have found out that they have a budget in place. They reach out to you and you place them in cohort. And during that lead time between the course start date and the actual time of registration, how do we keep them? And once we start the course, what sort of time commitment is required from the corporates or the enterprises or the SMEs? And how, because you know that you have a regular structure, you have a schedule in place. How does it work on the other side?
Well, we're generally very flexible in terms of starts because we appreciate that people don't want to be stuck with an academic year. And employers' financial years don't work like that. Employers' businesses don't work like that. So we tend to start people every 2 or 3 months. So for example, this year, in 2022, there were January starts, there were March starts, there will be September starts, and we haven't planned the back end of the year yet. But in addition to that, sometimes people can be slipped in at other times, as it were. And it's fair to say, it's like anything. If you have an apprentice, then they need to join an existing cohort. Then clearly they need to join us at a sensible time. Whereas if you have 10 apprentices, then you can start a cohort for them, in which case we could start in literally any time in that we agree with the employer. So there is a large amount of flexibility. I mean, what we find in bid and proposal is, of course, because companies tend not to have massive bid teams. It's not like, say, customer service, where a company or sales, where a customer might have scope for 10 or 20 sales apprentices at a time because they have a sales force of 600 people. With bid teams, they tend to be much smaller than that. Even large bid teams will tend to be smaller than that. So there's generally speaking, only 1 or 2 apprentices at any one time from any one organization. I think it is worth adding to that, going back a little bit, that of the sectors that work with us, as well as construction, logistics, and professional services and business services, it's quite noticeable that actually the bidding sector works with us. We have quite a few apprentices on program who actually work at boutique bid writing providers, Thornton and Lowe and EIB and Pipster. And I know Bidmasters is thinking about it and so forth. So it is certainly a concept that the bidding experts, external bidding experts, buy into, and they believe that the apprenticeship works for them, and at least have been willing to give it a try. And in case of EIB, I believe they have several apprentices on program with us. So we're really proud of that. It's not just the commercial operators, but also the bidding boutiques that work with us. Sorry, Bhaskar, what was the last part of your question?
Sorry.
I've gone so far off down my old track that forgotten what you actually asked.
The last question was, okay, it's amazing that, the group, the JGA Group, has flexible onboarding. But once the people start, what sort of
Right.
time commitments the employers needs to dedicate to do that, and the paperworks and stuff that goes behind the scenes?
Okay, good question. Yes. So at the end of the day, the apprenticeships are, although driven by employers in many respects, they are a program of the government. As I said, the word apprenticeship is protected by law by the government. So there, up front, there is some paperwork. There's a contract with the provider, us. There is the online portal that you need to set yourself up in, or if you're not, or for larger companies, they will already have the portal set up, but you'll need to register the apprenticeship on it and say that you're working with us or whoever you're working with. There are skill scans. So, for example, an apprentice will look at all of the knowledges and the skills and the behaviors that define a great bid coordinator, and they'll rate themselves on 1 to 10 or 1 to 100 in terms of how far they think they have them. Because clearly, if somebody says, well, actually, I'm brilliant at that, and I'm brilliant at that, and I'm brilliant at that, then the government says, well, what do you need an apprenticeship for if you can already do it all? So there is an element of the skill scan, which identifying where the real needs are, both in terms of identifying the areas which aren't real needs, but also in areas that they really need more focus on. Everyone has strengths and areas for improvement, and it identifies that, and that then feeds into a plan which we put together with the employer, and that plan is for that specific apprentice and that specific job, and that details over the next 21 months in our case the training that everyone agrees that apprentice needs. And that will include, of course, the monthly tutorials, and it'll look the monthly coaching one-to-one, but it'll also capture the internal training aspects using different systems, for example, and maybe some work shadowing. So the bid and proposal coordinator spends a day in finance to understand how that works and how that mixes with what their team does. So there's a large element of, if you think of a traditional graduate program, I guess, there's very much the same sorts of elements. There's absolutely no reason why an apprentice shouldn't be treated in just the same way as a graduate. And in fact, of course, in many cases, the apprentice is a graduate. So there is some paperwork to do. But I think once the system is up and running, especially if you're in a large company, it's relatively straightforward. You will have a professional somewhere in your HR department who's well used to doing it. They will have done it for business administration apprentices, or for customer service or engineering, or whatever it might be, depending on what your organization does. And we take you through the process. And if you need help with recruitment, then we can provide that. Or if you want to do your own recruitment, that's also fine. Or if you're upskilling an existing member of staff and you don't need any recruitment, then that is also fine as well. We're really essentially a service provider. We're on the government register of apprenticeship providers, as are the other people who do this apprenticeship. And our role is to help you and to try and make your life as easy as possible, whilst making sure that the apprentice gets a truly awesome education and training package, and that you finish really happy that you've got a great bid and proposal coordinator, and that's really what it's all about.
Totally, Richard. Richard, is there any, because obviously, as you know, once a person commits to take this 21-month period, sometimes they might not be available on a monthly basis to attend the tutorials or the coaching classes. How does it work in practice? Is there any flexibility around it where the 21 months can be shortened into an intense 12 to 14 months? Or if they miss that, some of the sessions, they could catch up, or they could join a new cohort or something. How do you work through these logistical?
Yeah. A lot of sessions are recorded. So absolutely, if you do miss something, particularly the tutorials, the small groups, seminars, if you do miss it, you can catch up that way. Clearly, one-to-one conversations can't be recorded if you're not there, because there'd be no one to have a conversation with. But of course, that's really flexible. If it's one-to-one, It's at a time to suit you and time to suit your employer and the time to suit you, the apprentice, you, the employer, and also to suit the coach. So that's not quite such a difficulty. We understand that by definition, a bid team goes through really busy periods and periods that are a little bit more fallow. And therefore, we have to try and work around that as best we can. There does need to be some recognition from the employer that there will be need to be time spent doing this kind of stuff. But like I say, we live in the real world. You do hear about apprenticeships, the slightly scary statistic that apprenticeship would spend 20% of their time doing off-the-job training. And that is absolutely true. But an off-the-job training is not necessarily time in the classroom or time in the coach. Both of those are part of off-the-job training, but equally, it could be a project in the workplace about how to improve a process. And that would count because it's not the everyday job. Off-the-job training really is doing things that develop the apprentice. Shadowing the finance function for a day would count. Doing a project for process improvement would count. Going to a conference potentially would count. So it's the sort of things that the apprentice may be doing anyway, if your employer that's focused on that, or apprentice who's focused on that, or non-apprentice at the time. But so don't be too scared of the 20% of the job. It does not mean somebody is not in your team 1 day a week. That's not what it means at all. What it means is they should be learning stuff 20% of their time, and that learning stuff could be working through online resources. It could be in a class or with a coach. It could be shadowing. It could be at a conference. It could be spending some mentoring time with the line manager, talking through the performance and looking at ways to improve it and things. There's a whole long list of potential activities which can be labeled learning for this purpose. We work in the real world. Even the government in this context works in the real world. And they know for apprenticeships to be popular, they've got to be good. And if it's too stiff in terms of what's allowed, then clearly it won't be straightforward. And the powers that be in terms of Ofsted, who look at training providers, everyone wants it to work, and to work it needs to be good, and to be good it needs to do what the apprentice needs to do what the employer needs, and that's how you get a great apprenticeship.
Totally, Richard. Richard, as you rightly said, the system is flexible. Yes, it might at the outset look complex, but you have made it work for the past 4 or 5 years. Find a way to make it easy for the employers, make it work. So the students or the apprentices go through the program, they complete it at the end of 21 months. This endpoint assessment that you're talking about, talk us through how that works, Richard.
Right. So essentially, the training element is 18 months. Then for bid and proposal coordinator, clearly bid writing and the whole bid team is usually focused around documents, and in terms of written documents. So it's unsurprising that, quite rare for an apprenticeship actually, there is a written document in terms of the endpoint assessment. So the endpoint assessment, carried out by the Institute of Sales Professionals, or the old Association of Professional Sales for those who know it better, together with APMP, comprises of a knowledge test, and that's 6 questions, comprising 5 essay-style questions and 1 practical written assessment. So that's a assessment based on practice of projects that they've carried out during the apprenticeship. Then there's a professional discussion. So that's a structured discussion with an independent assessor based on a portfolio of evidence. And that portfolio has been pulled together by the apprentice over the preceding 3 months or possibly more. And it's something that they've already done. So what matters is the discussion. It's knowing your material. It's making sure that your portfolio covers the sorts of things that the assessor is going to be asking. And that's it. It's just the 2 elements. And it's worth saying, I think, that we have never had anybody fail the assessment at the end. I think one person made a mistake in a knowledge test because they didn't answer a question and redid it. But other than that, if an apprentice is done well enough to reach that stage, should pass with flying colours if they've been on our programme. And of course, the key is therefore to make sure that apprentices do stay on programme to that stage and make sure that they get a good experience.
Okay, Richard, kudos to you and your team for this. Richard, you have done this, as you rightly said, for many employers, and many apprentices went through the program. Let us split up these characters individually. What are the do's and don'ts from the apprentice's point of view? And what are the do's and don'ts from the employer point of view, Richard?
I think for the apprentice, the big do's and don'ts is understand that you have things to learn. I mean, it's fairly fundamental that if you don't have anything to learn, you shouldn't be doing an apprenticeship. And in fact, as I said, if we found somebody knew everything, then when we wouldn't encourage the apprenticeship. We'd look for other alternatives for them. But there needs to be an element of humbleness of the apprentice. By humbleness, I don't mean they have to be tea monitor. I expect all employers. I mean, I get the tea at the office, so I expect all employers generally share this task, or all sorts of people do it. And I'm not saying apprentices shouldn't make the tea. I'm just saying an apprentice is an employee, and they should be treated like other employees, but with allowances made for what they don't know, and to support them to gain that knowledge and those skills and those behaviors. So the apprentice needs to be humble, and the employer needs to accept that what they've got is not the finished product, or at least not until they finished. Almost by definition, what they've got is somebody who is learning how to become the finished product, and therefore needs a little bit more mentoring, needs a little bit more support, needs a bit more. If you're very young, and not apprentices don't have to be very young, apprentices could be all sorts of ages. But if you're in your first job, even if you're a graduate, 21, 22, how do you know when to knock on the door and interrupt a meeting, or whether you should keep the telephone message and hold it for somebody coming out of that meeting at the end? And there are some really basic things that everybody who works, has been working for years, has an instinctive understanding, and doesn't necessarily understand that people who haven't been working for years, or people who've worked in very different environments, don't know. And why should they know? How should they know? So a little bit of I was going to say, not relaxed attitude is not the right term. A little bit of flexibility and supportiveness from the employer is really what that apprentice needs. And the employer needs to be prepared to get a little bit involved with the apprenticeship as well, and to make sure that the apprentice feels that the provider, whether that's us or someone else, is doing a good job, and the apprentice is learning the right things and can apply it. Because if they're not, then clearly there's a problem. So it's interact with the provider, make sure that you have some flexibility with the apprentice, and you're providing some appropriate support. And from the apprentice's point of view, know that you're there to learn stuff, and it's not just a job, though, it's a career. So what you're investing now, which may be a little bit of financial in terms of earning a little less, and is an investment in their future, which once you progress from this, the world is your oyster. You have lots more options.
Richard, well said. Richard, I know I portaled you into bid and proposal apprenticeship, but you and your team does a lot more. Talk us through other apprenticeships that you also run, please, Richard.
Oh, we run for the growth functions of commercial organisations. We run the sales executive apprenticeship, and some of our clients for that include Britvic and Thatcher Cider and Premier Foods and Nestle. We have a big food and drink client base for sales apprenticeships specifically, and I think it's an element of history there, but it's very interesting how these different apprenticeships attract different client bases. We do PR, public relations and communications apprenticeships, and we do a suite of marketing related apprenticeships. So digital community managers, that's managing communities through social media, for example. Digital marketing manager, that's a level 6 apprenticeship. So that's a degree level apprenticeship. But it's really focused on people who are marketing managers. They need to have direct reports, and they need to manage finances and budgets. So we are talking about things not just for people whose first jobs there are, but there's a career path within apprenticeships, moving up to relatively senior levels. And apprenticeships can these days go up to level 8, which is master's degree level. They exist, not yet in bid and proposal, but in some other areas they do. There's certainly a first degree sales apprenticeship, for example. So there's all sorts of possibilities. The other thing I haven't said and would just like to say is one thing about working with an apprenticeship provider is it means you're not doing things on your own. So if you are looking from a CSR point of view, or if you're looking for diversity to help challenge the way the organization thinks, or people from a different background to your normal recruitment base, then working with a good apprenticeship provider should mean you get lots of support. And in fact, the government has various schemes available to fund additional costs that an employer or a provider might incur from working with people who are very different and have disadvantages, such as neurodiversity, for example, which is dyslexia or dyspraxia or depression or various mental health or well-being challenges. And I'm not saying that an apprentice necessarily has any of those things. I'm merely saying that if you're looking for diversity and you're looking to do something a bit different, or you're keen to bring in people from a very different background, maybe a disadvantaged background, then doing it as part of an apprenticeship can give you a lot more support, because we go through this with lots of different organizations in the same sorts of roles. And so we do have professional supports on tap for neurodiversity from psychiatrists and psychologists, for example, who work with employees on these sorts of challenges, and with employers as well. How should you treat somebody who has these sorts of differences? So it is important to remember that doing things that are a bit different through an apprenticeship does mean you're not on your own and you have a little bit of help. I think that's very much worth saying. And like I say, that could be bid and proposal, or it could be marketing related, or it could be, in our case, it could be data, particularly data within marketing and the sales sectors. It could be sales, it could be communications, and they're the main ones that we do for commercial organizations. And we also do communications and policy for public sector in particular.
Totally, Richard, totally. Richard, sometimes there is this general perceptions like, companies have a set budget, which they need to use. At the same time, other colleges and stuff, apprenticeships tend to be like underlooked, saying, hey, I don't want to go for apprenticeships, etc., because of this kind of an inertia that goes around. What advice would you give providers or influencers within a body to just say, hey, if you want to upskill, apprenticeships is also an avenue? Yeah.
I think the apprenticeship is a brand name, and it's a brand name whose cachet, prestige maybe, had been devalued a little bit over the years. And I think it's on the way back. Over the last 5 years, I think, with more universities becoming involved with apprenticeships, the professionalization of the training industry, much more specific job roles that really relate to all sorts of companies and not just the traditional building and hair and beauty and adult care and things like that. There's an opportunity to use apprenticeships to professionalize sectors, to improve diversity in areas that are traditionally very white and middle class. Apprenticeships are very supportive. Small groups, one-to-ones. It's not 150 people, generally speaking, in a class, and it's tailored to people's needs. And really, I think there are now degree apprenticeships available, for example, where people get degrees as part of their apprenticeship. So they work 4 days in their employer and they spend a day a week at the university having lectures and things. So there's a whole range of things that apprentices from level 2 to level 7. And I think that lack of cachet is absolutely changing. And in fact, there's been discussion about whether it could introduce post-nominals for people who've graduated from apprenticeships. So just in the same way that when you've got your degree, you become a BA Hons or a BSc Hons in your name on your LinkedIn profile or on your business card or wherever you write it down, or if you've got your MBA of whatever it might be, why not have APP for apprentice? And then maybe even in brackets, it could be the job role. We'll see. It's something that was floated a while ago. I don't know if it'll get anywhere, but I think it's a brilliant idea because it's about parity of esteem. People tend to look down on vocational training often, but vocational training in this context is not worse than academic training. It's just different because it's specific. And in fact, people, as I said, who've been through lots of academic training will still end up doing vocational training because it's where the jobs are, and it teaches you the real skills that you're using in the workplace to make us all happier and more productive.
Brilliant, Richard, brilliant. I think, this talk is fascinating for me, even though the apprenticeships as a principle is UK driven, and we talk much more about UK. I'm sure that the principles can be lifted and dropped globally as well.
The principles can absolutely be used anywhere in the world. The only thing that makes it UK driven is the way it's currently funded. Mm-hmm. So there is absolutely no reason why somebody couldn't come on an apprenticeship course from India or California or Sweden or wherever it might be. It's just that there'd be a commercial arrangement around the cost, essentially.
Totally. Nice, Richard. I think thank you for giving a nice overview of what apprenticeships are, why we need to have it, the roles of the 4 different people, like the learning providers, the government, the apprentice himself, herself, and also the employer, and also talking it through the behind the scenes of how the program works specifically for bid and proposal apprenticeships. We also touched more about logistics behind it, the paperwork, and also some little inertia that goes behind it. And you nicely touched, this is not one. There's a lot more apprenticeship that goes hand on hand with it. Any final thoughts, any final words, Richard, before we close the episode?
Yeah, I think apprenticeships in general are on the up. They're rising in terms of esteem. They are becoming better recognized as the new generation, people who start an apprenticeship over the last 5 years since they all changed. Of course, it takes a couple of years to finish, and therefore, gradually there'll be more and more people out there who've done it, and they might have entered the apprenticeship as a school leaver or as a graduate, or they might be employed and doing a higher apprenticeship like marketing manager or systems thinking or something like that. And as more people get involved at all sorts of levels with apprenticeships, I think some of the qualities that make them unique will shine through. They're the only form of training, structured training, really focused around specific jobs and specific roles, and just there to be right as opposed there to be general. And that will be increasingly recognized. And I think, like I say, I think their prestige will continue to increase. And I think you'll be hearing a lot more about apprenticeships in 5 years' time than you do now. And I think you'll be hearing a lot more still in 5 years after that.
Totally, Richard. Thank you so much. Wish you, your team, your family, everybody, all the good health and happiness, Richard. Continue to bring in new talents to the industry, continue to demystify the apprenticeships and simplify it. And look after yourself, Richard. Thanks again. Wish you all the success.
Thank you very much.
To our listeners, thank you so much for tuning in. Please visit batchyscribble.com/podcast to listen to this episode and check out any of our other previously recorded episodes. If you've enjoyed today's interview, don't forget to subscribe, review, and share the Scribble Talk podcast. We hope you'll check out our next episode where we interview another industry expert and special guest. Until then, it's Ashley Kays,
Pastor Sundram,
signing off.